Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cooke. My guest this week is Keith Frankish. Keith is a philosopher who specialises in the philosophy of mind, psychology and cognitive science. He has affiliations with the University of Sheffield, the Open University and the University of Crete in Greece. He's arguably best known for arguing that consciousness is an illusion, which is what we talk about today. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Keith Frankish. Keith, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, looking forward to chatting. So maybe we can begin with, if you could describe maybe the way that philosophers often talk about consciousness that you find maybe not helpful or unproductive.
Well, there's a way of thinking about consciousness that makes it seem what David Chalmers calls a hard problem, something that it's just almost impossible to explain, certainly to explain using the tools of cognitive science as we understand it. Most people nowadays, most philosophers, practically all philosophers, accept that the brain is somehow the basis of consciousness. Okay, so you need to have a brain to have consciousness, and the brain somehow produces consciousness. But there's a way of thinking about consciousness itself that makes that claim seem almost absurd. I mean, think about some other mental function, something like memory. We've got an idea of what memory is. It's just something like putting it very crudely, a storing of information about things that have happened. And it's not too hard to understand how a physical system, a system like a brain, could do that, could store information. It would need to, we have examples from artificial systems, from computers and so on, where they can store, they can make little changes inside to their internal states, to the states of the hard disk or whatever, that can later be retrieved and that encode information about the event that is being recorded, and that can be later accessed and interpreted by the rest of the system. And so something happens, the system encodes that in some sort of memory trace, then later retrieves that memory trace and uses the information to guide its behavior. So we have that's very extremely schematic, but it doesn't seem impossible that a brain could do something like that. And similarly, if we talk about vision, in one sense, it's not hard to see how a brain could see, but we can make artificial eyes, cameras, and we can build robotic systems that can use the information from those cameras to guide their behavior, to enable them to move their limbs and pick things up and so on. So then we could say that the robot is, in a sense, seeing. It's got a visual system. Okay. So it's getting visual information, it's using that information to guide its behavior, and therefore in a sense it's seeing. And similarly, we could do the same with hearing, and even with things like pain. We could say the robot can detect when it's been when its body has been damaged in some way, and take appropriate action. But what about the conscious side of seeing and hearing and feeling pain? That seems something totally different. That seems to be consciousness I think our intuitive conception of consciousness is something like that. It's a kind of private world. Somehow behind our eyes, there's this world, this inner world. And this is private, absolutely private to each of us, our consciousness. It's something that, it's a world that's only accessible to the person whose consciousness it is. Nobody else can get into my private world. And all this stuff that my brain is doing is somehow connected with that private world. So when my eyes pick up information about the world, stuff happens in this, about the public world, stuff happens in this private world. I kind of see things, right? But that seems something more than just my brain getting information about the public world and using that information in some ways in the way that a robot might do. There's this, we say, what it's like to see things, what it's like to feel things, what's happening, what the character of this private world of mine. And similarly with pain, the character of this private world. And this now, how does the brain produce this private world? It seems like a kind of almost like an absurd question to ask, because after all, the brain is part of the public world. It's a physical thing. It's made of neurons and interconnections, a very complex one, which are sending signals, neurons sending signals to each other, and neurotransmitters and hormones and stuff all different. And we could study that in complete detail, but we never penetrate into this private world. So then it seems we can never understand the connection between the two. And so we have this conception of consciousness that makes it radically distinct from the rest of the world. Now, if you think of consciousness that way, obviously you're not going to be able to use the tools of cognitive science, which explain what the brain does, which explain the functions of the brain, to explain consciousness. You're going to have to then simply say, well, look, you're going to have to say something like, well, there is this inner world, there is this private world, and somehow it's related to the public world, to the process in the brain. And all we can really do is just try and correlate what's happening in the brain with what's happening in the private world. And we just leave it at that. We don't explain how the private world comes into existence. Now, so we just have to take this private world as, if you like, metaphysically fundamental. It's just there. Somehow it comes into existence. It's dependent. It seems to be dependent on the brain. Most people nowadays don't, I guess most philosophers nowadays don't think that this private world is a separate thing, a soul that could survive the death of the body and the breakdown of the brain. I mean, well, we know all too well how damage to the brain, disease to the brain can affect what happens in the private world. So it does somehow seem to need a brain, but it's somehow more than the brain. It's something that the brain produces in some way. And we just have to accept that that's what happens when you get complicated enough brains. And well, that's all the most we can do is try and correlate the states, the states of this private world, the states of what its likeness, what it's like to see different things, with the activity of the visual system in registering information about the world and so on, and then we stop there. And we just, that's how the world is. And that's one way to go. That's where a lot of people go. And there's various ways of trying to refine that, make it more precise. And of course, there are puzzles about how this private world can affect the public world, because it does seem to. It seems that what happens in our private, in our consciousness, affects, if I feel pain, that affects how I behave. But so how do we get causation between these two worlds? And certainly it seems that what happens in the public world affects what happens in my private world. If somebody kicks me, that produces pain. So we need somehow to sort out how these two things can interact. And this is a problem that goes back to Descartes and probably beyond. But we just kind of leave it at that. Now, that's the picture that I want to challenge. That's the picture that I think is maybe quite natural. I'm not sure how natural it is. It's certainly one that's widespread. And my aim is to challenge that picture. Not to say that it's absolutely completely wrong, that when people talk about this, that there's just no basis whatsoever to what they're talking about, but that it's a kind of, it's a wrong interpretation of what is happening. It's a sort of interpretation, sort of story we tell ourselves about our existence. And it's in some ways it's a useful story, one that makes sense to us and that we value actually. But it's not, we shouldn't take it too seriously. And we shouldn't think that it shows something about the fundamental nature of reality. So that's roughly where I'm going.
And this is often described in your work as claiming that consciousness is an illusion, or phenomenal consciousness, to use the kind of precise philosophical jargon. And this can lead to some confusion about what precisely you're claiming. You know, I think from my reading of you, it seems that you're not claiming that, you know, the difference between me and a rock, if you hold a red apple in front of me and in front of a rock, I assume you agree there's something different is happening, right, for me versus the rock. So the consciousness in that sense does exist.
Absolutely. It's the way I prefer to put it is that what the picture that the story that I've just given you is, some people say that's what consciousness is. So if I do not reject that picture, I'm rejecting consciousness. I would say, no, that's a kind of theory of what consciousness is, and a bad theory. But that doesn't mean there isn't consciousness. Look, let's just start with a very simple approach to this. Look, I have a cup here, it's white, I'm attending to it, I'm having a conscious experience of the cup. Okay. Somebody kicks me in the shin. Okay, I enter the state we call pain. Okay, that state is real. It's a conscious experience of pain, a conscious experience of the yellow cup, a conscious experience of hearing the fan on my computer, or anything that I tend to perceptually, I'm having a conscious experience of. All I mean by that is that there is some distinctive kind of state there that happens, which we can recognize when we have it, when we undergo it. I can recognize when I'm in pain. I can recognize when I'm seeing something. Let's say yellow, it's white. I can recognize when I'm hearing things. I can recognize these states. I can tell other people about them. They're important to me. Okay, if you kick me on the shin, I will enter a state, the state that I call pain, and I will not like it. Okay, and I will want you I will want you not to do it, and it will provoke all sorts of reactions. That's absolutely true. I'm not suggesting people can't see and feel and hear and respond to the world. I'm saying that seeing and hearing and feeling and responding to the world and so on doesn't involve the existence of this utterly private mental world. Okay, we can account for it in a different way. I think the way that this talk of the private mental world and what it's like is a kind of is a way of describing the state the states we enter when we have conscious experiences. A way of describing them, and it's often a useful one. We can make sense of it, and we can use this. We can talk about what experiences are like as a useful way of communicating what's happening to us, and it conveys useful information. We just shouldn't take it too literally. So yes, there's a huge difference between myself and the stone. The stone doesn't react to the world at all. I react to the world in exquisitely sensitive ways. I'm like a bundle of throbbing sensitivities with respect to the world. Okay, so I'm charged with sensitivity, and I'm also a bundle of reactive dispositions. I don't just sense things, but I react to them in hugely complex ways. I'm sort of a throbbing, vibrating mass of sensitivities and reactive dispositions. That's me. Okay, and the rock isn't. The rock's just inert. It doesn't respond at all. It doesn't sense what's happening to it, doesn't respond. It just behaves like what it is, a piece of inert matter. Now, so that's a huge difference. And that, I say, is what makes one conscious and the other not the presence of some sort of metaphysical extra in me, something in me that sort of another dimension of reality in me. Okay. So metaphysically speaking, as it were, I'm on the same level as the rock. Okay, there's no sort of extra element, extra fundamental feature of reality present in me that's not present in the rock. We're both just arrangements of fundamental physical particles in various ways, much more complex in my case than in the rock. So metaphysically, we're on a par, but in terms of sensitivity to the world, where there's a world of difference. And my claim is that consciousness lies in that kind of difference, not in the other kind of difference, not in the pure metaphysical. And I think this makes consciousness more important and significant because it locates consciousness in an interaction with the world, in how this bit of the world that is me is interacting with all the rest of the world. I'm like this throbbing bundle of sensitivities and reactions. And my that is my consciousness, if you like. I'm sensitive to the rest of the world. I'm not conscious in virtue of just having some sort of, I used this phrase the other day, that sort of élan sentimental, a sort of like a vital force, like having some kind of feeling force in me. I mean, what would that do anyway? Because then once you posit this thing as a fundamental extra, you have the problem of saying how it does anything. Because if it's belongs to a fundamentally different world, how does it plug into the rest of the world? Now, in my view, where consciousness is plugged in right at the very start, it is precisely a sensitivity to the world. It's a question of separating it and wondering how it gets. We separate it in thought, in creating, in developing this picture. And then we have the problem. Then we take that picture seriously. And then we have a problem of saying, well, how do we reconnect it now to the world? We have to start doing all sorts of complicated metaphysics and thinking about causation to try and plug it back in. Well, don't separate it in the first place. And to my mind, this puts consciousness where it belongs, right in the world. At the, you'll like this, at the interface between us and the world.
Right.
Okay?
I think this
consciousness
is partly how I think
interface
about
on the world. And then, so the real question is, to answer here is to talk about the nature of these sensitivities and these reactive dispositions that are the basis of consciousness, which is, I think, something that cognitive science certainly can do. And it's a massive task and a fascinating task. There's 86 billion throbbing neurons doing all sorts of wonderful work. I mean, wow, what a thing to study. And then the second question is, how is it that we conceive of ourselves in this other way, in this as something metaphysically special? How is it that when we have some sort of, we have the ability to somehow track what our own sensitivities and reactions, we have some kind of higher order ability to monitor what we're doing, I think, what our brains are doing. And that, I think, is what creates this, disposes us to this this inflated, metaphysically inflated conception of consciousness as an essentially private world. And that's why I use the word, that's where the illusion. I could have called it a fiction. Though again, that would have implications I don't like. It's an interpretation, a self-interpretation. Now, these are then the interesting questions. What's actually going on there in first order consciousness, and how do we come to create this picture for ourselves? So there, yes, I couldn't be more different from a rock, but it's not, but the difference is not the kind of difference that some people think it is.
Right. And I mean, so you were pointing towards, I think, a shared way we have of thinking, which is to do with our coupling to the world, our being in relationship to it, the essence. Well, instead of thinking that there is an essence, like, you know, so when we introspect and I've stubbed my toe, it feels like there's this qualia, this sensation of pain that has its own kind of feel. And I think we both agree that actually what you're experiencing there is the coupling of you as a system to the world, and you find that aversive, which means, what does it mean for it to feel aversive? It means you don't want that to happen again. Behaviorally, as you go into the future, you are going to avoid that. So there is no extra magical floating around qualia of painness that needs to be accounted for. There's just this coupling of the organism to the world and all of their complex reactivities.
Absolutely. But the last words you said, the complex reactivities, that's the essential point. It's not just that something's happened that I don't want to happen, although that's part of it. Much more has happened. All sorts of responses have been triggered in me, or dispositions to respond have been triggered across all kinds of dimensions: affective, emotional, cognitive, thoughts, beliefs. Memories have probably been triggered. called up. But more importantly, a whole raft of sort of under the surface changes have happened, which prime how I'm going to act next. That stimulus has primed me in a hugely complex range of ways to for the next sort of round of behavior, how I'm going to respond to the next bit of stimulation. Okay, let's say 86 billion neurons. All sorts of subtle changes have occurred, hormonal changes as well, stress hormones, and of course I'll be at the same time. It's not just that I'm sensing the pain; I'm also sensing these changes that have happened. I'm sensing the stress hormones, perhaps my heart's beating. In fact, I'm sensing that too. All kinds of things have been triggered in me, and those in turn are triggering more things. Okay, so there's this huge wave from that initial, kicking my shinse to. There's a huge wave of changes, which are then themselves having multiple effects, multiple let's talk in terms of reactions. There's not just one reaction, there's a multitude of reactions, which then cause further reactions and further reactions, and it spreads out. And this is being in pain. That's what being in pain is. Now, I get hand wavy here because we don't have a worked out theory, but the idea is we have some way of monitoring our unfolding reactive state. Okay, so we have ways of self-monitoring. The brain has ways of monitoring how its overall state is unfolding. And we can tap, and that's, let's suppose that the brain is creating a sort of model of how its pattern of reactions are unfolding, okay, across multiple dimensions. This is just a schematic idea. Obviously, it would need a lot of work to turn into a precise theory, but it's the idea is it's like the sort of story of memory that I gave at the beginning, a sort of how possibly story. So the brain is modeling its ongoing reactions to stimuli, as well as reacting to the stimuli. It's modeling how it reacts. So it's reacting to its reactions as well as to the stimulus, okay? And it's modeling this. And then we can tap this model, tap the information in this model, for purposes of communication. So if people say, how are you? We can sort of tap the information in this self-model and tell them, I don't feel so good, actually. Now, what we're saying there is this: my reactive state is unfolding in a way that's rather negative on various dimensions. But of course, we don't have access to all the detail of that reactive state. We just have a very schematic, coarse-grained appreciation of it. And so if you say to me, how do you feel? I don't know, I don't feel very well, or I've got pain. That's our schematic way of describing this complex reactive pattern that's been triggered by my current bodily state. Now, and so you say, what do you mean a pain? Well, it's a pain, it's just there, it's a pain. I don't know, it must be something. And then we're tempted to think of it as something primitive and unanalyzable and fundamental because we can't say any more about it. I'm seeing something yellow. What we're saying is that visual stimuli are triggering the pattern of highly complex pattern of reactions that are characteristic of the things we call yellow, of bananas and so on. That's what it's doing. And we call that the experience of seeing yellow. And all we can say about it is it's that one, it's the yellow experience again. And we tend to then turn this, because we have a word for it, it's the yellow experience, we think the yellow experience is a thing over and above all the reactions that we're actually obscurely gesturing at. And so we have this problem. We seem to have two things here. We have this complex pattern of reactions, and then we have the feeling of yellow. And how do the complex pattern of reactions somehow produce the feeling of yellow? And what does the feeling of yellow then have some effect back on? Does it cause further reactions? What does it do? We don't need that. The feeling of yellow is a way of talking about the pattern of reactions. And I think it's quite easy to see why we would have this ability. It's useful to be able to, for social creatures like us, to talk about our state. We don't just react to the world, we can also react to our reacting and tell people about our reacting. And so we can anticipate experience. We can say, don't drink that, it tastes horrible. Okay, that's a useful thing to say. Animals don't do that. You may see an animal drinking it and having all kinds of aversive reactions, and another animal may notice those and decide not to drink it or itself. But the first animal can't tell the other one not to. It's reliant on either having the experience itself or perhaps seeing the reactions another one has. But we can communicate about it. We can talk about how things are with us. Say, I'm in pain. I'm in awful pain. What's the pain like? The doctor says, well, it's in my leg and it's throbbing. And we have these very vague ways of characterizing pain. I can't really say, but it's there. And that's often enough. It's certainly enough for everyday purposes. Perhaps doesn't get us very far when we need to go into the fine details of exactly what's happened. But the doctor can use it as an indication. Okay, so I've completely forgotten what the question was. I'm sorry. I hope I've been answering it.
No, it's been great. I think this idea of whether when these subjective experiences feel like they have an essence, right? The essence of pain, the feel of it. To me, the major stumbling block when it comes to humans thinking about our own minds, but reality in general, is this tendency to categorize, simplify, and reduce things to having essences. And I think that's always an illusion, really. Like, even we see this with 20th century physics. We think that there are particles that have this firm kind of essence of some heft to them that is at the foundation of reality. Then we look and actually it turns out they don't have that. It's all a kind of interdependent flux. And so to me, I feel like the tendency of the evolved human mind to simplify into static objects versus being able to think in this rich kind of, think of things as a rich flow. Like, I think that takes us much further to what's really going on. And yeah, when you think of, if you think reality is at the bottom, there are particles, and that's the fundamental level. And then everything evolves in kind of levels of complexity up to complex brains. And then there's another essence of these experiences that somehow has to fit into that picture. To me, that whole picture is just a mistaken way of thinking about, you're not going to come to some solution of where does the subjective object of redness fit into this picture. So I tend to go with the kind of a process metaphysics of, there's clearly something happening, there's change, there's some kind of flux. Thermodynamics is a useful way of talking about the nature of this in physics. And we find ourselves there at the kind of the cutting edge of existence where things are happening. In order to survive, we're coupled to the world around us, and we have all these sensitivities. And then the difference between us and a robot, well, the robot is almost like if you were to kind of intelligently build a computer out of dominoes, or make a representation out of some inert process, and you're using your intelligence to instantiate it, but it's an abstraction. It's not really existing the way that you and I exist at the cutting edge of the bedrock of reality. So I guess to me, the fundament, I just had this image come to mind I've not tried to explain before, but it's like most people think that you have layers of reality from top to bottom, and the bottom layer is particles, and they are things and stuff and static. But actually, and then they all flow through time from left to right. But actually, I think the real fundamental axis is the vertical one of the flow of time, and the kind of, at every scale, the scale that we exist, we do exist as much as particles exist. And it's being at the cutting edge of change, of the kind of thermodynamic flow of existence that makes us equally fundamental. Now, I don't know if I've never used that before as an analogy. Maybe it's not very intuitive, but to me, that's important to think about what it is about us that's different between us having, because I do believe that we have, I would say that there is a phenomenon that we can label consciousness that does exist. And it makes sense to map it, but we don't really know what it is in its essence, and I'm okay with that. And I think the same thing with matter. I don't think science ever talks about the essence of matter. It's all about just mapping these phenomena. So I might be more in a kind of dual aspect stance, but there's a bunch of ideas I've just thrown at you. See if any of those inspire anything.
The process aspect, that's something people sometimes often suggest to me, actually, that I should recast this within a process ontology. It's something I haven't really explored. Something I'm going to look at. I really don't know. My motivation for this kind of picture isn't people think that my motivation is metaphysical. They think that I'm a hard-headed physicalist, that everything has to be physical, that consciousness in the phenomenal sense couldn't be physical, so I just deny it despite its obvious reality. That's not really how I say it. I just think it's, as I said at the beginning, these things that are happening now, that I'm having now, and I can see a blue painting over there when I look, these things are real, all right, and I'm pretty sure that I'm not different from anybody else in the way I experience the world. Some people sometimes suggest that I'm not really conscious. I'm pretty
You're
sure.
One of the famous philosophical zombies.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure I am. I'm pretty sure I know exactly what people are talking about. When I understand completely why people talk about phenomenal consciousness. I think I completely understand it. It's not that I just think what they're talking about doesn't make any sense. I don't think that. I know what they're talking about. I can see the redness of the red and the blueness of the blue, and I can, feel the pain. Punching me on the nose wouldn't have any effect, if like what some people think, because I'd say, yeah, I know that happened. I just think that the phenomenal realist way of conceptualizing what's happening is just a bad way. It's not that it must be bad because it contradicts physicalism. Even if it didn't contradict physicalism, I still think it's a bad way of thinking of it. And there are people indeed who think we can be phenomenal realists. We can be realists about qualia, the qualities of this in this private mental world. We can be realists about it, and physicalists. And I think they're just as wrong as the people who are the anti-physicalists. I think that just whole picture of, let's introduce the notion of the Cartesian theatre, the idea that this private mental world I was talking about, it's sometimes I think it's more often thought of than spoken of as a sort of interior theatre. The metaphor is one that Daniel Dennett introduced for characterizing this view. As I say, I think a lot of people say, no, I don't think that way, but I think their thinking is infected by, is influenced by this metaphor. That there is somehow between us and the world, there is a sort of a world of experience. And the world of experience is what we're really directly in contact with, the mental world. And it's only somehow indirectly that we're in touch with the world beyond it. Or even if we are indirectly in touch with the world beyond it, there is this other world that somehow accompanies our awareness of the world beyond it. So in a way, we're aware of two worlds. We're aware of the world of bananas and lemons and other things that are yellow, and then we're aware of yellowness in this the yellowness of these things in this world of experience. And that seems to me that too many worlds. We just need one. We don't need this mental world. People say we're not really aware of the cup. All I'm aware of is all I'm directly aware of is my experience of the cup. Well, am I aware of my experience of the cup? And what is my experience? How am I aware of that? And maybe I'm not directly aware of my experience of the cup. Maybe I'm only aware of my experience of the cup. What would it be like if I were aware of the cup? There's got to be some sort of process that's putting me in touch with the cup, but this process seems to be putting me in touch with it as directly as anything could. Of course, there's all sorts of things about the cup I'm not aware of, and I'm aware of it in a very sort of idiosyncratic way, dependent on the kind of sensitivities and reactive dispositions that evolution and my own personal history have given me. But well, the cup, I'm not. Anyway, so I resist the idea that this turns on prior metaphysical commitments. I think it's a bad way of thinking of experience. Period. Now, so I don't think, but I may be wrong about this, that switching to a process metaphysics would make a huge amount of difference to that. But I completely with you on this resistance to talk about essences. I don't, and I'm not. Your position seemed to be there's not much point talking about essences, but they might be there anyway.
I'm not sure if I think I take a kind of No, yeah, I would say they're not really there. That everything is just an interdependent flux. It truly is a process, and
So we don't need really a dual aspect thing. There isn't really another aspect, the intrinsic.
Well, I guess what I would say is the dual aspect. So I as a scientist, I tend to take a kind of, I think science it's quite a humble process of just trying to map phenomena that exist, right? So when we describe particles, we're not truly knowing what's going on there, the numinous nature of it. We're coming up with a map. And I think the same is true about, I do think there is this interior domain, or there's a reason we talk about this. There's a reason we're having this conversation now, because there's something that we're missing when we just talk about the third person objective description of the world. And I'm okay with just mapping that. And I don't think the mapping process requires a description of essences. But I think it's important to the point you were making about materialism, and people maybe think, well, you're just a hard-headed materialist and you're attached to that, and so that's why you're trying to collapse everything into that one side. I think for me, something that really maybe gives people a sense as to why there's a problem here is if you do take the folk psychological common sense view of introspection, where you close your eyes and you imagine a red apple and you feel like you are inspecting the redness, right? You feel like you're engaging with this ephemeral qualitative thing that's non-physical.
Absolutely.
And then you think, well, okay, well, we know all the causality in physics is in the physical. So how is my brain, how are my language centers that are attached to my physical mouth? How is that physical stuff interacting with this non-physical redness? And you and I think completely agree there isn't actually a problem. There seems there's a problem, but you've taken your folk psychological conception too seriously. And so for me, I think there's a kind of parallel process of there are representations that do have this dual aspect thing where I believe, or I hold that something's going on, that there's light in the room right now as opposed to darkness. And you can see that from the outside if you studied me physically as a system, but it also exists. It feels a certain way from the inside as well. That's the kind of dual aspect thing. But me telling you that I have these experiences is almost just a parallel process that evolved. I'm communicating to you, and there is no self that's looking inside my mind. They're both springing from the same physical process of representing the world and then communicating about it. So I do think, the essences don't come into any of the actual mechanisms.
Right, but you do think the essences are still there. Is that right?
Well, so yeah, I mean, this is a good thing to be pinned down on, because when I feel pain, do I think there's anything happening? Do I think there's anything that needs explaining over and above the kind of the reactions going on in me as an organism and my place as this system in reality that's coupled to the external world? No, I think science can map why I have an aversive reaction, why I'm as a kind of embodied bounded system, why that's not accessible to you. I think we can describe all of that without invoking any extra metaphysical stuff. I don't think, and this is what I mean about essences, like I don't think it's useful or to think about a thing called pain, an essence, something that really exists. So in that sense, I think I agree that it's kind of an illusion. I mean, we're really coming up against the kind of limits of language as to how we talk about this.
I'm inclined to press you on this a little bit, because
please do.
I mean, look, let's setting aside the question whether you believe there's an essence. Let's imagine a person who thinks, yes, okay, so I tell this story about the stimuli and all the huge waves of reactions they create in us, and how we monitor these reactions and then obscurely describe them as feels. And so when we talk about the feel of pain, we're just talking about our obscure appreciation of the huge raft of aversive reactions that have been triggered in me. Okay, and so somebody says that, yeah, okay, yeah, all that's happening, definitely, and that's why we talk about pain. But still, there is also an essence of pain there as well, which is something more than just those reactions. Okay, so although we can explain everything that's happening, including all my pain reactions, including my reports of pain, including my conviction that there's a real pain essence. So we can explain all of that in terms of the processes in the brain and in the world around us. There still is an essence of pain all the same. Okay, so and that's a position that I think David Chalmers is possibly. Certainly, he allows that it's a possible position. He thinks we might solve what he calls the meta problem, the problem of explaining all our judgments about qualia and so on. We might explain all of that without removing the hard problem. There still would be qualia, and there still could be qualia, and we still wouldn't have explained them. So explaining all our judgments about qualia doesn't debunk belief in qualia in the way that explaining all our beliefs about, say, flying saucers, if we could explain all those away without mentioning actual flying saucers, then normally people would take that to be a debunking of belief in flying saucers because they're all due to atmospheric phenomena or whatever. Then that would be a debunking of belief in flying saucers. Some people like Chalmers think that, no, we could be, it's consistent to hold that we can explain all our judgments about qualia without denying that there are qualia, because we're directly presented with the qualia, and we directly, they're still here immediately to us in some way. Now, let's suppose you have that person. Then I think that I like to put this thought experiment to them. Which of these would really matter to you when pain matters, right? So, okay, so we can imagine, I've used this thought experiment before, so it may be familiar to some people listening. We can imagine suppose you're going to have an operation that will be quite painful. And you can have two kinds of anesthetic. There are two anesthetic options available, of which you can only take one. Now, one would kill the pain in the sense that I've been talking about. It would kill all the aversive reactions. So you wouldn't react to what was happening to you in any way at all, psychologically, physiologically, behaviorally. Your stress levels wouldn't rise, your stress hormones wouldn't rise. You wouldn't believe you were in pain, you wouldn't want the pain to stop, you wouldn't enter any emotive states, you wouldn't have any fears in the psychological sense. You wouldn't struggle, you wouldn't cry, you wouldn't have any memories of anything bad happening to you and so on. You would just lie there perfectly still, and we can imagine you were awake, and if you asked how you are, you'd say, I'm fine, absolutely nothing happened. And you'd be completely sincere. But still somehow the essence of pain will be there. All that's been killed is the reactions. The other one does the opposite, leaves all the reactions in place. So you still react exactly as you would to having an operation performed on you without anesthetic. You react in exactly that way, but it kills the essence of pain. So all of this, you're just like a struggling zombie on the table. So one of them, you're a real non-zombie with a real non-zombie pain, but all the reactions have been killed. The other one, you're a struggling, manically stressed out zombie, but there's no essence of pain. Now, if you think there are two things here, the reactions and the essence, then those should be at least conceivable, even if you think that in principle the two things, that in practice the two things always go together. And so my question is, which one would you choose? In other words, which kind of pain matters to you most? Suppose you were that kind of person who believed in both, which would you say?
I mean, I think the thought experiment does make it very clear that it can't be that these things are separable. And this is why I go for a dual aspect thing, where I'm not saying that theoretically they could, they tend to go together, but they could be separated. I mean that the pain is nothing but the reactivity, and we're not just talking about giving something that paralyzes the body. We're talking about the neural activity, everything in the system. But I do think that when we approach reality with this task of trying to describe it, we can measure our tables and we can do all this objective world stuff, and then I can tell you about this subjective world stuff, and that it's, I guess what I'm saying is phenomenology needs mapping as well. And I think in terms of mechanism, I don't think it's a truly different domain metaphysically. I think it's two perspectives on the same phenomenon. That if you stand over there and you from your perspective say James is in pain, I can describe his brain activity and all that stuff, and then from over here as the organism, I can report to you what is going on from this perspective. I do think there's a difference there, but again, it's not metaphysical. It's more just pragmatic, I guess.
Yeah, I think. I mean, you said what the thought experiment brings out is how these two things are connected. Well, there's an obvious explanation of that. One is that they're kind of the same thing. The other is that, which I find very hard to understand, how they could actually be the same thing, which is a form of identity. I think the other way in which they could sort of be the same thing is that our talk of this is just an obscure way of talking. I don't know which is which. Our talk of the qualia is just an obscure way of talking of the reactions. You know, that it's just our first person vocabulary for talking about these things. It's not a vocabulary that the neuroscientist would use, because well, I don't know, they might be able to empathetically use it, but it's not a vocabulary that arises out of the neuroscience, as it were. It's a vocabulary that arises out of our ability to tap our own self models. And so, I mean, you could say, well, yes, the pain is real because the reactions are real, and what we're really talking about when we talk about the pain is the reaction. So the pain's real. The danger in the reason I don't put it that way, I don't put it like that, is because people tend to reify the pain as something distinct from the reactions. And that's the kind of pain that I think we shouldn't talk about, because then we just introduce basically a fifth wheel. I mean, it's not doing anything. And we have to go through all kinds of struggles metaphysically to make it do anything. And I mean, what I'm inclined to say in terms of those in the thought experiments is, I definitely take the ones that kills the reaction, because in killing that, you're killing everything that could possibly be pain. You know, pain is just a way of talking about that state that you put somebody in when.
Right. I mean, I think this points to actually something that's important with this discussion, which is that I guess I approach this and say, my experience of the world, I experience pain, and then the job of science and philosophy is to account for why. Now, I can try and do that in a way that just maps phenomenon. I don't have to talk about essences. I don't have to bring anything supernatural into it. My instinct is that the difference when people have a kind of reaction against the perspective you're offering is that perhaps it's rather than being aligned with saying, okay, I know my experience is real, this feels kind of concrete in a sense. Instead, it seems to leap over experience into abstractions and say, I'm more aligned with the abstractions of physics and the maps of science. And that, I think that when it, because this stance actually does evoke quite strong feelings in people, I think I have noticed. And I sometimes think that might be the phenomenon that people, that's what's going on. They're like, how can you, it's almost like self-abandoning our experience of the world and aligning with ideas over reality.
Yeah, no, I get that, and I really think I can and should accept that point, provided it's made in the right way. Look, I am this throbbing ball of sensitivities, right? Okay, and when I tell you how I'm throbbing, how I'm vibrating with the world around me, that's a direct output, that's a direct expression. That itself is an expression of how I like to say, I like to use these metaphors like I'm like a bell that's resounding with the striking of the world. Or I am this, I don't know, I'm starting to get poetic here, but I am this sort of, I mean, you have a nice, you use predictive processing and as a way of characterizing the nature of these, what I'm trying to gesture at here as a self-sustaining organism that is constantly fighting, as it were, to preserve its integrity. Okay,
I was
and
going to
that's what we
say, I
are.
have the same instinct, I think, for what you're trying to describe. There's this
Yes, I'm just
thing that I find quite hard to, I try my best to try and pin it down and scientifically, but yeah, like this sense of we are so vividly alive, and that's the stakes are so
yes,
high as these thermodynamic systems and this is why I say like the cutting edge of reality. Like this is really happening. We're not, you know, once we're bones and they start fading away, they're not as energies, you know, well, we are made up of these energy processes, and there's a
yes,
big difference there. This kind of brings us back into the process stuff I'm talking about. But
yes.
actually, I do think that this gesturing, even though it's less precise, is a big part of it.
Just
Is
at
what's
our own
going on with us.
vitality, at our own insistence on preserving our own integrity, you know,
Right.
against the world, as it were, of stressing our own existence as a center of sensitivity, a center of, I mean, I'm trying to put it here in everyday terms, but I think the terms that predictive processing theory uses are a very nice way of giving this a more formal characterization. So we are this, and our reports of how things are with us are a direct expression of that sense. So when I say I'm in pain, that's a direct expression of how I am plugged into the world at this moment. And it's and as you say, of my, I'm at what you said, at the cutting edge of reality. So
Yeah.
that's a direct expression of that. And yet, absolutely, there's no question of my saying, well, you're not really in pain, or that's wrong, or you're mistaken. Of course you're not. What I'm saying you might be mistaken about is how to interpret that claim and what sort of metaphysics to read into that claim. I'm not saying you're not in pain. I'm saying that being in pain doesn't quite mean what you think it means. It doesn't involve the existence of some metaphysically distinct realm of reality.
I think it's good to remind people that our folk psychology, you know, as these evolved organisms, when we introspect and we feel like we have free will and we can move our arms willfully and there's a self, all of these things to me, upon closer inspection, seem to be illusions. And so it's not that crazy to say that that other aspects of our minds could not be the way they the way they seem.
Absolutely, because how could we have that kind of direct, infallible access to a part of reality? It would have to be. It would have to be another world, a world that doesn't operate in the way that the world mapped by science does. Now, maybe there are other worlds, I don't know, but do we need to suppose that in order to explain what's happening with consciousness? And does it help us explain it, or does it just introduce a kind of block to our understanding? And that's what really annoys me here, really worries me about this, is because it seems a retrograde step. It's sealing off all that's really important into some private, inaccessible mental world, and I don't like that. I mean, this isn't the reason for adopting the view, but I don't like. I mean, whether I like it or not, it's neither here nor there. But I feel it's obscuring things that are actually much that aren't obscure, that are just difficult to understand. Can we know what it's like to be another person? Can we know what it's like to be a bat? I think we can, if we know enough about how they throb and vibrate in response to the world. Okay, but that means studying them in a detail and a depth that may be practically impossible. But I don't think there's anything that I don't think we just give up on the project. So who knows what it's like to be a bat? Who knows whether the bat's really feeling pain or whether its pain's like us? Who knows? So we don't know. We can't tell this. No, study bats. Find out what it is like, what it really is like, what's a bat sensitive to, and how a bat reacts to the things that it's sensitive to. I mean, what else could it be to be a bat than to be able to detect certain features of the world and to react to those features in certain ways? That's what
I think
I
share this intuition that if you study like an organism, if it has kind of trichromatic vision, 3 dimensions of color, you can map out the kind of relativistic framework of their experience. And so, and actually, I think, that it doesn't make sense to think of individual experiences. I think it's all through, light is only defined as not dark, and so.
Yeah.
You could, in theory, far from actually being entirely inaccessible, you could reconstruct someone's subjective experience. Now, if you were to visualize that, you'd have to make some concessions, and maybe you don't know which way. You can flip the polarity on light and dark, or something. Although actually, I don't think that's probably true.
No, I don't
as
think
well.
that,
I think
once you've done all the relative stuff, I don't think it doesn't make
exactly.
It doesn't make sense to ask whether a monochromat sees yellow and black, or blue and black, or white and black. It doesn't make sense. It's a matter of, as you say, the relative.
Right. So I think we agree on this idea, but I guess the place where I think maybe we started by saying that this folk psychological idea of qualia and the way we inspect them probably isn't what it seems, but the lights are on. There's something happening. There's a difference between holding the apple in front of me and the rock. And in my picture, this is the phenomenon that I think this perspective taking, the thing that I do want to say does exist in some sense, some interior subjective world. I think that is synonymous with being a bounded living system that has to interact with the world to survive. I think that's the only place that this could come into existence. I don't think you can have a little bit of perspective. I don't think it can be a gradually emergent phenomenon. I think it's a kind of binary thing. I'd be interested, to get your thoughts on that.
I don't know whether I don't like hard edges.
It seems that life, though, is a kind of an attractor state, in that there's nothing that's a little bit alive, right? We collapse from, and I'm not saying there is a true hard edge in reality. If you could map the thermodynamic landscape from living to dead, there would be a continuity, but you'd find it a kind of saddle point where if you're half alive, half dead, you're going to collapse very quickly into one or the other.
Well, I don't know. Think about it from the evolutionary perspective. You start with the simple self-organizing molecules that can do very simple kinds of replication, and that naturally create sort of lipids that create boundaries or whatever around themselves.
Right.
Waffling a bit here, but there must have been a continuous development from very simple inorganic compounds through to the first through to inorganic replicators, through to things that start having boundaries, very simple chemical boundaries, and so on. There must have been a progress like that. And what point do you say it starts to have a perspective?
Well, I think it's notable that none of those intermediate processes are still around, right? We don't see them self-replicating enough in the stable way that living systems do. It really seems to be this attractor.
Yeah, very short term, yes. I mean, you'd certainly get to a point. You certainly get to a point where this is a self-organizing, self-sustaining entity, and then it becomes appropriate, I think, to talk about it as having a point of view, because it starts throbbing as an individual in relation to. I keep going back to these sort of things. It starts to have a distinctive throb in relation to the world that it sustains, and that's what I'm inclined to say there. Okay, we can kick in now, talk about it having a perspective, and we can map that perspective for very simple organisms. Probably we can completely know what it's like to be a very simple unicellular creature. We can map out every sensitivity it has and every reaction it has to those sensitivities, and that's what it's like to be it. And then the rest of the process is just one of ever-increasing complexity, to a point where the complexity is so great that I was going to say that the only creature that can really have a sense of what it's like to be it is the creature itself, but I think there might be aspects of ourselves, of our own subjectivity, to which we're blind in that sense. We're not necessarily the best mappers of our own responsiveness. I think this is not a terribly counterintuitive thing. The example I like to give about knowing what it's like to be someone else is someone you've lived with for a long, long time in a very intimate way, and you can get to the point where you kind of know what it's like to be them, and perhaps in some ways you know how they are feeling or responding better than they do in some ways. I think you can see that they are detecting and responding to things in ways that they perhaps haven't themselves acknowledged. Maybe that sounds a bit arrogant, but I think that is true. I think that and of course, there's a persistent danger of sort of over-interpreting in the light of one's own experience, which I think sometimes we tend to do with animals. But sorry, again, I forgot what the question was.
No, that was excellent. You were speaking to I think earlier what this says about what we are, and I think for some people there's an anxiety that by aligning with the kind of materialist viewpoint that might want to eliminate consciousness or say it's an illusion, that we're going down a road of you're just a clockwork mechanism and it kind of strips all meaning away. But I've heard you speak about this in a way where actually by saying that we're not really enclosed in these subjective spheres that are mutually inaccessible, that actually creates a conception of ourselves that's far more interconnected, far more really embedded in the world, and we see ourselves as part of the world.
Oh yeah, absolutely. As I say, I don't think ethical or emotional responses to a theory of mind are necessarily a good guide to whether it's true or not. So I don't think the fact that I find this a kind of uplifting view is relevant, but it is relevant in the sense that it's a counter to people who think that it's the opposite. That the people who think it's a dehumanizing view. I don't see it that way at all. I see the other one as dehumanizing, the one that isolates us from each other in private mental worlds. I think that's a very alien sort of view that we can never really know what it, because after all, it's a fairly short road from there to something like solipsism, if you take that seriously, that all I really know, all that I'm really acquainted with is this private mental world, and everything else is a sort of inference from that, and possibly a faulty inference. What a horrible view. I want to be part of the world. I want to be in it. I want to be deeply enmeshed with the natural world. And I think it's probably salutary for us to think more of ourselves in that way, as deeply enmeshed, a product of and deeply enmeshed with the natural world. It might be a useful corrective to this tendency to think that everything sort of outside us is a kind of instrument for us to use to cultivate what's really important, which is what's in here. I say I don't think this ethical dimension is a reason for endorsing the view, but I think it is a reason for not rejecting it as being ethically unattractive. I think it's just the opposite. I found idealism, I find a deeply worrying sort of view. I mean, the idea that all this is just something in my mind, and no, I don't. I want me to be a part of it, not it to be part of me. I want to be there in this world, which produced me and nurtured me and shaped me, and will eventually unshape me. But then when it's unshaped me, it will go on shaping other people and other sensibilities. Perhaps some of those sensibilities will even be shaped a little bit by the traces that I've left. So in a way, I will still be part of the shape of the whole thing. I just find that a very attractive and rather comforting view of things. And as I say, that isn't a reason for endorsing the view, but it is a reason for not finding it, I think, inhumane and degrading or anything like that. Just the opposite.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's a surprising amount of overlap between this view, aspects of this view, and deeply kind of meaningful spiritual experiences people have, ones that I think can be understood naturalistically, like, when people meditate or they just become very still, they often they're met with a sense of deep awe at existence, just a sense of grandeur, and of the sublime, in the same way when you're looking at a vast mountain or something. And I almost think, that if a lot of people have a tendency when they have those experiences to go to the idealism view and say, well, the universe is a vast mind and I'm part of that mind, and that's kind of what's causing it. Whereas in this view, or at least I should say the scientific kind of more mainstream view, where we are these localized organisms, it feels to me like it's almost the geometry of looking out at this vast universe that you are one aspect of, that creates that sensation of awe, of like, we come into existence and we say, wow, really? Like this vast, amazing thing is happening. And in that picture, a sense of it being part of an interconnected whole is also another aspect of these insights that people have. And I think you're right that a pitfall when people have these experiences as well is they really can go down a kind of, if there's anxiety, they can go down this solipsistic, worrying hole of feeling disconnected from the world, feeling like they only exist in their subjective sense. And it was very valuable for Descartes to point out the way that you can theoretically, do these experiments where you say, okay, maybe I'm in the matrix, I can just go into my experience, but that's only one perspective. The other perspective is, as I'm talking to you now, your words produce an actual physiological response in my body. We are deeply connected. There's clearly more to reality than just my mind. And theoretically, this could be a dream with no, it's all coming just from inside my mind, but that seems a really inelegant explanation. It seems it feels far more like there are autonomous other things like you out there influencing me, and that we are part of a kind of interconnected whole.
And of course, this centering of everything in a private mental reality, of course, it naturally induces a worry about what will happen to that private mental world, and a fear of its end, which is probably quite adaptive from this is something that Nicholas Humphrey emphasizes in his work, that particularly in Soul Dust, that he thinks this illusion of a private mental world is a very adaptive one. It makes people take more have more concern for their own lives and the lives of others. So it might be adaptive, but at the same time, it also can be a source of great anxiety. And there's a certain freedom in thinking, in finding that, yes, I am a particular important nexus of events in this world, and and I desperately want to sustain myself as this nexus, but I'm not really anything distinct from it. And when the nexus does dissipate and collapse, that won't be it won't be the end of the world. And I find that rather comforting. And you can also find that meaning that doesn't lie wholly in this private world. It lies in the world that you're a part of, and what effects you have in that world are as much a part of you as what happens in this private world. You are distributed, in a sense, through all the effects that you have. And many of those will continue. So I find it a much, this anti-Cartesian view. I find comforting and quite inspiring. Though, as I just keep saying, that isn't a reason for endorsing it. But I think it's a reason for not rejecting it on the grounds that it's disparate. I mean, put it another way, I don't see that. A lot of people find that having a scientific focus is somehow dehumanizing, and that the scientific picture has no room in it for wonder and mystery and spirituality. I don't find that at all. I think exactly the opposite. I think what it doesn't have room for is our rather egocentric, somewhat, perhaps I shouldn't use this word, but somewhat childish notions of wonder and meaning. But it develops its own conceptions of wonder and meaning, and even spirituality, which are more, I think, sophisticated and better rooted than some of the let's say, naive ones that rely on something like a sort of magic. You don't need magic for meaning and mystery and meaning and wonder and spirituality and value. Value doesn't have to be some mysterious essence. Value can be rooted in processes, in interactions with things. Value is there in how I interact with the world. That's where the meaning, that's where the significance lies, how things affect me and how I affect them. So I'm getting a bit preachy now. I'm sorry.
No, that's wonderful. It's a very inspiring place to take us towards the end. And I completely agree with that picture, because to me, science as a methodology is completely. This is also why I always describe it as a map, because it in no way contravenes the meaning we feel, or it can allow us to, as you say, move beyond our first instincts that may be initially comforting, but probably unwise. And as you say, I think childish is a fair word. But then I guess I also see that I think there are sociological phenomena where certain people who maybe do want to explain away, who feel more comfortable to live in the abstractions, gravitate towards science, and then maybe there's a kind of a cultural bias against these things. So people pick up this feeling that if they're interested in all this in meaning, then actually science isn't the place for them. So I think that's almost like some social change I'd like to see in that area.
I think that's a very good point. I do. I think you're right that some people who do gravitate towards science actually aren't really interested in the sense of significance and meaning and spirituality that, if you like, that science can underwrite. And this is one of the reasons why I love the work of Nick Humphrey, who I've already mentioned, because he is he's a scientist, he's a psychologist. It's a wide range of skills and talents and experience. But he also, if you look at his book Soul Dust, it's packed with references to mystics and to poetry and to the arts, to music, to religious traditions and so on. He's very sensitive to all of that. And he sees it as perfectly in harmony with his science, with his scientific interests. And he sees the two as mutually supporting. And I do too. And so I think some of the, I'm not going to name names, but I'm sure everyone knows who I'm thinking of. Some proponents of a hard-edged, scientific, if you like, view of the world, opponents of religion, I think do their own position a disservice in underselling what it can offer. It's not merely that science shows that these somewhat naive and childish stories won't do. It does show that, but it offers other stories, I think, that are actually more sustaining in the end, because they're not as fragile as the naive stories. They're not as easily, they won't let you down in the way that the naive stories will. I use the word spirituality, and I'm okay using it. A spirituality that's rooted in science isn't going to let you down in a way that's rooted in dogma and, a great point, and folk tales. So it's that integrated vision. I mean, let's come back to, I always like that story, that line from philosopher Wilfred Sellers, about philosophy being about, probably not going to get the quote right, about how things in the broadest sense of the term hang together in the broadest sense of the term. And he described the project for science as bringing together the manifest image, the world as it presents itself to us, with the scientific image, and keeping them having a stereoscopic vision, which shows how you can hold on to this vision while not rejecting or denying any aspects of the scientific vision. And I think to a large extent you can do that. It does mean accepting that things aren't always quite as they seem to you. That it doesn't mean denying the language of the folk image. It doesn't mean stopping talking about beliefs and desires and consciousness and all this kind of stuff. But it does mean perhaps not building too much into those, getting them in the right focus, seeing what work they're doing in relation to the other view. And thereby setting it on a firmer basis. The point in a way, so I say what I'm doing is not denying consciousness, but setting consciousness on a firmer basis, rooting consciousness in reality, rather than in some imaginary world of of qualia.
That's very well said. That's the line you should open with in future, I think. That's a really, it reassures people that this is a benevolent project rather than a negative one. Yeah, exactly.
I started but I've got more preachy, I think.
Yeah, I'll play the episode backwards. Yeah. No, this has been wonderful, very stimulating. Thank you, Keith. I'd recommend people check out your wonderful podcast with previous guest of this podcast, Philip Goff, Mind Chat. It's a great listen. And is there anywhere else you'd send people to look into your work?
Well, there's most of it's on my website at www.keithfrankish, all one word, keithfrankish.com.
That sounds great. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cooke.